Greetings, welding inspectors. My name is Karsten, and my goal here is to clarify requirements for visually inspecting welds in accordance with CSA W59 for structural steel applications. In teaching a current class to third-year welding engineering students, I've had to convert presentations to video format for online delivery and thought maybe others might benefit from this lesson. I see on the Canadian Welding Bureau website that there are 5,058 companies in Canada certified to CSA W47.1 who typically use W59 in addition to another 519 companies from outside Canada, so this standard does get a lot of use. Over the years, I've seen mistakes made during weld inspection from ignorance, criteria confusion, and yes, sometimes laziness. So my message here is to inspect to the relevant acceptance criteria and don't accept defective welds, or mark not perfect but acceptable welds with yellow markers for repair. Clause 11.5.4 defines the acceptance criteria, and that's pretty straightforward for discontinuities including cracks, lack of fusion, and craters. None is allowed. Things get more complicated though in evaluating porosity and undercut, and that is what I want to clarify in this presentation. Knowing inspectors enjoy a challenge, things get interesting in that there is not one, but two sets of differing acceptance criteria within this standard. Clause 11 in green is for statically loaded structures like steel fabrications used in a building. Clause 12 in blue is for cyclically loaded structures like the steel fabrications used for bridge construction. We will see that Clause 12 is more stringent in permitting less of these discontinuities, partly due to more concern for fatigue failure in cyclically loaded structures. In evaluating undercut, there are three considerations. You must have clear definition from the designated engineer as to whether Clause 11 or 12 applies. It's one or the other, not both. There is differing amounts of undercut for material under and over 25 millimeter thick, as well as considering its depth and sometimes length. For Clause 12 only, there are different amounts allowed for undercut transverse versus parallel to the primary stresses. For due diligence, you may need to have clarification from the engineer. In deciding whether to accept or reject welds based on porosity, there are four considerations. Again, there are differences between these two clauses. Instead of just marking the first porosity you see as a defect, instead you will need to measure each porosity pore diameter. If no pore exceeds the maximum diameter allowed of 2.5 millimeter, your next step will be to add the sum total for all pores over 3 different weld lengths. One last consideration for Clause 12 only is the differing amount permitted for fillet versus groove welds. Now let's take a closer look at the undercut evaluation, starting with Clause 11 for statically loaded fabrications. Thankfully, this hard-to-use figure is no longer specified in the 2018 version of W59, although it is still shown. While things are a little easier in not using figure 11.4, I'm going to read you the less than explicit statement from the latest W59 on the undercut permitted. Here we go. For material less than 25 millimeter thick, undercut not exceeding 1 millimeter for any length of weld, with the following exception. Undercut shall not exceed 1.6 millimeter for any accumulated length up to 50 millimeter in any 300 millimeter. This is my interpretation of that ambiguous statement. If the undercut depth is more than 1 millimeter over the length of the weld, it should be rejected. If it does not run the entire length of the weld, then up to 1.6 millimeter depth is permitted, but for no more than 1/6 of any 300 millimeter long weld length. One other comment regarding undercut evaluation is that unless your fingernail is calibrated to national standards, please use a proper gauge for measuring undercut. Things are a lot more complicated for Clause 12 inspection in that there are 3 options to use in evaluating undercut. One of these first 2 options would be used when primary stresses on the weld are either along or across the weld. When stresses are across the weld, a very minor amount of 0.25 millimeter is permitted regardless of the length. When primary stress is parallel, a maximum of 1 millimeter depth is permitted. If the engineer specifies a weld does not carry primary stresses in the fabrication, then it is his or her decision on how much undercut is permitted. Now let's look at porosity evaluation, starting with statically loaded structures. Any porosity pores exceeding 2.5 millimeter diameter are rejected. When porosity exists but is less than that maximum, then you need to add the diameters of individual pores, and some total of 10 millimeter is permitted per 25 millimeter length of weld. A further evaluation of each 300 millimeter length of weld is then done with no more than 20 millimeter of porosity allowed. For fabrications welded to Clause 12 requirements, fillet weld porosity is evaluated the same as Clause 11. When inspecting groove welds, porosity evaluation is very simple in that none is permitted. So there you have it, folks, and I hope I've helped clarify visual inspection requirements to CSA W59 as it pertains to undercut and porosity evaluation. I think you've seen that for proper inspection to code requirements, you must be diligent in following these guidelines. And your inspection kit should include the proper gauges as well as a flashlight and maybe a magnifying glass to measure porosity. You will also need clear definition on whether Clause 11 or 12 is applicable, and in the case of Clause 12, we'll also need to know direction of primary stresses across each weld. If you have questions or comments, please let me know. Cheers!